Lecture. It is my pleasure to now introduce to you our speaker for today. Professor M.V. Rajeev Gowda represents Karnataka and the Indian National Congress Party in the Rajya Sabha. Until recently, he was Professor of Economics and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, where he also served as Chairperson, Center for Public Policy. He has been a director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India and a Carnegie Council Global Ethics Fellow. He has a PhD in Public Policy and Management from Wharton. He is the founder of the Resurgent India Trust and is also an avid quizzer. He's here to talk to us on the regulation of risk. Please welcome Professor Gowda.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you, Uday, and everyone involved with Beyond Carlton for inviting me to deliver this lecture today. First, actually, somebody told me about different people coming here this evening, and I was worried that people assumed that when I talk about the regulation of risk, I would talk about financial risk or something like that. That is not the domain here. And just I wanted to clarify that, and there will be no discussion on Punjab National Bank and Nirav Modi and everything else. Anyways, let me just go right to the broader theme of health, safety, environmental risks, etc. And the key questions that I'm trying to address here, and this is from a broad field called risk analysis, is about why do societies tolerate certain risks and actively reject others? Are people rational in terms of how they respond to risks? Do governments regulate risks appropriately? And how does policy change occur? What does this all mean for India? I mean, I brought this up partly because this is a literature that I'm really donning my professor policymaker hat here, and so there's a lot of literature that I've got to share with you, and we're going to try and see whether the experiences around the world actually are applicable in the Indian context, and of course some bridge to the context of fire safety and where things would be going forward. I mean, some of that has already been detailed. All right. So as we can see, different countries tolerate different risks. Okay. So this is just, a few days ago in Florida. And I was just reading something on Twitter which said there have been 45 days in the new year, more or less, and there have been at least some 28, gun violence-related incidents in the United States, right? Now, the contrast is actually with the United Kingdom, where once there was a school shooting many, many years ago, handguns were banned, and you have not seen a recurrence on the scale that we see in the USA. All right, and this is not something that seems to be new, and we had the Las Vegas that music concert shooting, things of that sort. So this just does not get regulated for a particular reason, which is that there is a constitutional provision there, which may be archaic, but is still valued by some very, very powerful groups, such as the National Rifle Association. And they are very active in ensuring that handguns or arms in general are not banned. Anyway, that's just one example from the United States context. In India, we tend to live with death very, very, in a very routine manner. Okay, so things happen. I mean, we recently changed the railway minister, but otherwise we used to mock him as a derail minister until a while ago, because there was just a spate of derailments and deaths, and none of us bat an eyelid. This is the way things are. That's the way we go about it. This is, of course, the Bhopal tragedy, and there are numerous instances of such out there. Very few get the attention, get the kind of legal follow-up that Bhopal certainly did. We tend to ignore the epidemic of farmer suicides in our midst. This is also something that is routine, and we don't pay enough attention. We are trying to lower, maternal mortality, infant mortality, etc., which are still too high for a country of our size or our wealth. And of course, looking forward, we're at least engaged in some kinds of discussions about whether we should allow genetically modified vegetables or not. nothing's happened, but that discussion has happened. Okay. Or when there are people who oppose nuclear power, we file lots of sedition charges against them and put them in jail. So that's something else that we also do. So basically, we have lots and lots of risks that are out there, and we react in different countries, different contexts. You have different responses. So over the years, there's been a very, very interdisciplinary field called risk analysis that has evolved. And the main sort of subheadings within that are risk assessment, risk perception, risk management, and risk communication. So what this really means, the assessment part, is you might call the scientific aspect, right? How dangerous is something, right? And how do you assess that? If it is, how dangerous is a bridge, or how dangerous is is travel by road, right? Then you would actually look at so many vehicles, so many accidents, so many fatalities, and then say you can come up with some metric which allows you to compare one with the other. Anyway, risk assessment is the domain of scientists, of economists, people who are trying to get a fix on this is the truth in some ways. But risk perception tells us, and I'll go into most of these in some more detail, that how we as people see risks is very different from what the scientists would like us to. Okay? And so there's this whole challenge that people's perception differs substantially from the scientific assessment. And so the job of risk management is to somehow try and reconcile the two, to try and ensure that we find solutions to regulate and manage risk in a manner that addresses the scientific demands as well as, of course, people's preferences. And one way to do that is risk communication. When you talk about building awareness in the context of fire safety, it is, it's also, that's an aspect of communication as well. All right. When you want to classify risks, there's again no shortage of, you shouldn't be thinking about all these. You lose a lot of sleep. There's no shortage of risks all over the place. There are some which are man-made, some which are natural. Some, in the context of climate change, interact, right? And just last night, I was reading some article about, about what a 6-foot rise in sea level would do in terms of the impact on coastal cities and populations around the world. And it's too horrifying to contemplate. Anyway, so there is man-made risk, there is natural risk, and there is the interaction between the two. And this is just a typology of those all. Okay. So, the example I'm giving you here about risk assessment is what, say, the insurance companies would do. They would say, let's take this population of people. Let's see, how many accidents take place for people between the age, men of the age 18 to 30 or something like that. And then based on that, they would come up with, an assessment of how much they would have to pay out and, some other statistical calculations. And then they would be able to arrive at, an insurance premium. So some particular amount, that is their assessment of what would be the risk involved of insuring that particular class of people. All right, but again, moving very quickly from the scientific, because we want to really get at regulation, at how people deal with these things, there is, the scientists would, and the economists certainly, would want to balance costs and benefits. So the notion of what is the optimal level of risk. You can't eliminate risk, right? Okay, but what you can do is achieve the best possible protection for a certain investment, right? So that's the optimal agenda. But at the acceptable notion comes to people's preferences. People would say, look, that's not acceptable. We do not want this kind of risk here anymore. And in the course of this lecture, you will see examples of what I mean by that and how things that used to be acceptable before are no longer acceptable, right? How did that change take place? What is the mechanism that drove that? That's something that we'll look at. All right, and so really there are lots of risks that are unacceptable, some which are tolerable, and of course a lot that we just routinely live with, depending on who we are and what culture we're in, etc. And this is all a lot of detail, but I'm showing this and sharing this because if anybody wants these PowerPoint presentations, you're welcome to have them. In most cases, I would also have a reference, if not in the main slide, in the notes below, if you want to pursue this in some more detail. Okay, so then people trying to assess risks would come up with 2 or 3 kinds of mechanisms, things called fault trees. If something, how could a system break down, right? See, for example, a nuclear plant. A lot of this science emerged in the context of nuclear safety. You don't have a track record of 100 nuclear accidents that you can actually say, okay, this happens here, that happens there. You've got to anticipate these things, and based on that, you come up with a variety of scenarios and think about probabilities and interactions, etc. So there are, one technique is called fault trees, another is called event trees, right? So if there is, and this is an example that's pertinent to the theme here, if there is a fire, will that smoke detector detect it? So there is a probabilistic aspect there. Will the sprinkler system kick in, right? And I'm just looking around the room to see if there's anything here. But anyways, will there be an alarm that will sound? Okay. And just this afternoon, the one friend who came to see me this afternoon for some meeting said that she had just come from a fire safety drill in her apartment building because they had a new set of equipment. The previous equipment was there for 20 years and apparently was not working. And the condition for purchasing the new equipment was that they would come and conduct, the vendor would come and conduct a fire safety drill, which I said, oh, you've given me an anecdote to mention here today. But that's sort of typical of the situation out there. So if that happens, will you be able to exit, right? And so then you start looking at probabilities, yes or no, etc. And you work out a fairly complicated, probabilistic risk assessment of whether this is going to be dangerous or not. And most often they'll say, oh, the chance of something happening is 1 in a million or 1 in 100 million, etc. And so they will tell you that it is safe. Okay, this is just more of the same. And so many, many years ago, there was a report on nuclear plant safety, and that argued that the likelihood of reactor accidents is much smaller than that of many non-nuclear accidents having similar consequences, right? So then the report says, we looked at other non-nuclear accidents, including fires, explosions, toxic chemical releases, dam failures, airplane crashes, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. And you can see here that there's a mixture of natural and technological and man-made hazards that are all bunched in together. But if you were to ask somebody, if nuclear power, nuclear reactors are safer than any or all of these, people may have a different view. Okay? And so that's generally a concern that scientists may tend to be much more actually overconfident because of their familiarity with how things are. And the overconfidence also comes from the fact that we're not able to think through all the different scenarios that are involved. What could actually go wrong? Even human ingenuity when it comes to finding new ways of screwing up is actually is something that we can never predict. Okay, here we have Mr. Homer Simpson, whose job actually, if you recall, was in a nuclear plant, right? Okay, and anyway, the basic thing is the 1 or 2 incidents that did take place, that did not have fatalities and things like that, did have the impact of actually shutting down America's nuclear industry. Okay? Because basically the public reaction was so hostile after that that people said, look, we do not want to run the risk of going further with this technology. Recently, after Fukushima, not only Japan but Germany as well, which relied significantly on nuclear power, has also said that they're not going to go further with that technology. Right? And the Indo-US nuclear deal, one aspect of why George W. Bush was willing to change the rules of the game internationally to accommodate India was because he had a nuclear industry out there with no business within the country and was looking for, maybe I shouldn't say anything like this. No, this is a triumph of our UPA government. But the basic point is there are business considerations as well, given that the home market doesn't exist anymore for nuclear power there because of public opposition, all right? So what is this thing called risk perception? What drives that? All right? This is a picture of, I think, the construction of the Empire State Building or something like that. These are construction workers sitting on a girder having lunch. Okay, and they're way up there in the sky. Anyways, so, okay. And so this whole issue, what are people willing to accept? What are they frightened about? What are they absolutely going to reject, etc.? So going back to 1969, one scholar looked at a variety of technologies that are accepted by people and said, what are their characteristics? And based on those characteristics, can we make some inferences about what people are willing to accept and what they're not? So he found that people were willing to accept risks which are 1,000 times greater if they are voluntary. For example, driving a car. Okay, I'll just give you an example for those of us who have gone on motorcycles, right? So if you're actually driving a motorcycle, you are capable of a lot more exciting maneuvers and without thinking at all about the risk than if you're sitting on the pillion. Right? I mean, there you're wondering what the hell is going on, right? That whole notion of being, in control, voluntarily taking part in these things is a huge, it makes a huge difference to your perception of risk and everything that goes with it. And certainly this involuntary aspect of an accident, right? If you're living in the vicinity of a nuclear plant and something happens to you, then, it's not happening because you asked for it. It's an involuntary imposition on you, and that's really something that people get angry about. Anyway, this whole research triggered an explosion of studies trying to understand whether people were fundamentally irrational. Right? So what are people accepting? What do they live with? What don't they live with, etc. And the people would look at, what does the public rank as the most dangerous technologies? What would experts rank as the most dangerous technologies? And they found that there were, quite significant variations between the two. And there's more or less a pattern that you're able to get hold of, that people tend to overestimate rare events and underestimate, frequent and familiar events. Anyway, this is all the science of it. But basically, what affects risk perception is opinions of family and friends and co-workers, and the source of the risk information, how credible it is and how credible it is not. I mean, this is all in the pre-WhatsApp forwards era. So, I think today we have no idea what people are going to pay attention to and what not. This is the era of fake news. Anyway, so basically, this question, are people irrational? Can we, if they are, can we educate them? Can we fix their biases? And can we move forward? That was one line of approach. But the approach that has become more dominant today is the one which says, look, actually you've got to accept people as human beings who have a very, very complex understanding of risk, a very nuanced, multidimensional understanding of risk, which includes not just those quantitative figures of probability and outcome, but also each one of us has our own sense of what we value, different things that we're willing to accept and not, and fundamentally, therefore, a perception of risk cannot be seen as irrational. It is a multidimensional aspect of it, and trying to understand where it's coming from. People have done what you call cluster analysis, and ultimately the two main domains that emerge. One is knowledge, and the other is something called dread. Dread is that feeling in your gut, in your stomach, when you're not happy with something, when you're uncomfortable and worried, right? That's what that is. That's not happening here in your brain, it's happening inside you somewhere else, right? And so this is all too small to be visible to you, but the things that we have to worry most about are the ones in the top right-hand corner. They're the ones that society would have real problems with. Right at the top is called is DNA technology, basically genetically modified stuff. And let me see, even I'm getting older here. I have to pull out glasses now. Um, Pesticides, fossil fuels, mercury, satellite crashes, nuclear weapons fallout, nuclear reactor accidents, radioactive waste, coal burning and pollution. Okay, so some of those things are the more dangerous ones. The ones that are in the other corner, not dreaded and which are known: fireworks, motorcycles, smoking, home swimming pools, bicycles, skateboards, things like that, elevators, alcohol. Okay, so a whole bunch of dimensions of risk are out there, and basically, that just shows you what people are upset about and what they would like action on. So, so one of the things we can say is that risks that are voluntary, which are under an individual's control, where the benefits clearly outweigh the costs, there's a fairness associated with how they're distributed. It's not just the poor who are impacted more or something like that, right? Okay, and that happens. If you think about all of us, at least here, we're not sitting with a bottle of plastic, a plastic bottle of water, right? That's a clear indication of who gets to drink, pure water and who doesn't, right? And so basically, that's one of the unfairness, the distributional aspects of who's exposed to polluted water and who's not. Then whether people are much more angry if a risk is man-made, rather than if it's natural, and if it's statistical. What does that mean? Basically, if it's just a very small chance of something going wrong, and if it's generated by a trusted source, if it's familiar, if it affects adults rather than children, affects you personally, etc. These are just ways of explaining what this is all about. And so fundamentally, risk perceptions, people aren't irrational. They are expressing their values, what they're concerned about, etc. But there's another dimension. It is the outrage dimension, when people get angry, right? And when do people get angry? So that really is when these dimensions all fit in once more. Okay, so the same factors, right? So those involuntary, artificial, exotic, hard to understand, memorable, dreaded, potentially catastrophic, etc., tend to generate much more anger than the ones that you're willing to accept. Okay, and the same thing here. It just continues some more. So these are all dimensions of understanding where people's perceptions of risk are coming from. So I happen to have, my PhD is on environmental policy and risk management and those sorts of domains, and edited a couple of books. The last one in this domain, not the last one called Judgments, Decisions, and Public Policy, and most recently one called India's Risks that came out in 2014. And so I've had a chance to sort of be in this domain for quite a while. And it's been a very fascinating domain, because we'd go to this annual conference and suddenly someone would have a new paper which would open your eyes in a whole different direction. And one of those was when a bunch of social scientists showed up. Okay? Until then it was the scientists, the economists, the psychologists. And these anthropologists essentially came and said, look, there's something else going on, which is that people have worldviews. They have very well articulated ways of looking at the world, and if something fits in with that, then they're happy and comfortable. If not, they would be up in arms and want change. So what are those worldviews? I haven't gone deep into the whole thing, but they classify people into 3-4 groups. One is hierarchy. Okay, and hierarchical societies are where we accept authority and that somebody is managing things, etc. Risks are acceptable as long as institutions have routines to control them. If we think that the government, the IAS officers, the IPS officers, the civic authorities are all out there doing a good job, and we respect them, and they know what they're doing, then we tend to be that we would fall into that category. We would not question things too much. Okay. The egalitarians are the ones who would say, look, this is this is too much. We don't need nuclear power. Let's go with renewable energy instead. Okay, and let's find ways which are much more suited to us engaging with nature in a very, very low-key manner. etc. The individualists, on the other hand, tend to even see the word risk not as something to be worried about, but risk in the context of opportunity, right? So in the financial world, that's what they would say, right? Higher risk, higher return. Okay, so that's the kind of viewpoint of people in individualistic societies, and there the attitude is leave it to the market, let people make their own choices, and that would be that category. And then, of course, apparently there are societies which are a little more fatalist, where they would think that life's a lottery, risks are out of control, and safety is a matter of luck. So where would we fit in this? Fatalists, really? Okay, so we tend to accept risk a lot more in India. I mean, I would say more substantially we're probably hierarchical, right? Where we tend to believe that the systems in place, that the authorities, the scientists, etc., are people who have earned their right to manage these technologies, and we believe them, right? So, for example, the Atomic Energy Commission is something that continues to get a lot of respect. So that's what it is. But certainly, the fact that we don't outrage over every accident is an aspect of fatalism that fits in very well with the larger Indian ethos, I suppose. Okay. Anyway, so basically, these scholars would argue that people select certain risks for attention and disregard others in a way that reflects and reinforces the particular worldviews to which they adhere, right? So, for example, are we outraged by the deaths of manual scavengers, or is it one more thing that happened, right? Or farmers, okay? Things like that, right? These sorts of things we tend to be, different groups react differently. Okay. So how do things change? How does public perception change? And as a consequence, does the regulation of risk change? Okay. Let me take you through one example, the case of tobacco, right? So when I went to the US to study in 1984, study public policy and economics, the classic example of a very powerful interest group was tobacco, the tobacco lobby they would talk about. Just like I gave you the example of the National Rifle Association, such a powerful lobby that in spite of a spate of gun incidents, tragedies, you are not seeing any policy change, right? So tobacco was like that. They would always find a way to say there's no cause and effect impact, okay? And so the tobacco lobby was very, very powerful, and there was no real regulation of it in an intrusive way. Societal attitudes were also quite different. When I had this might sound outrageous in today's day and age, but after my 10th standard had finished, when we were about 15, 16 years old, we used to go to French class at the Alliance Française. We used to have a long gap. And then it was actually fashionable to smoke in class, believe it or not. Okay? I can't imagine it today, but we would all be very, very, Madame, je parfume, and light up a cigarette in the classroom. This is a different era. Okay? And these are ads that you don't see anymore, but, so these are also out there. And I put these together because they're actually, some of them take you back to interesting memories. But the bottom left one says, it's from Wazir Sultan Tobacco, and it says, support the Indian industry by smoking guaranteed Indian-made cigarettes rather than anything else, okay? The bottom left old one. And of course, how many of you know made for each other? What does made for each other in the wills stand for in the ad? The cigarette and the filter, not the couple necessarily. Anyway, that sort of thing. And then, of course, even in the 80s and 90s, Joe Camel was the smooth character, the guy you wanted to hang out with, have a cigarette with, that sort of thing. And then, of course, something changed, right? And, now, these the anti-tobacco ads started to emerge, and things like that. But what changed? How did, the power of the tobacco lobby disappear? How did regulation really take on? What happened in between? Any ideas? Cancer research has been going on for a while. But go back to the dimensions of risk that I mentioned, right? When do we get upset? Man-made risk is fine. Then anything else? voluntary, involuntary, right? So basically, it's okay if you're smoking yourself. But if you're blowing it on me, and the science is now telling us that this secondhand smoke is a problem, then, then we have a little bit of we have a real problem. The poor Marlboro man's horse has gone and died as a result of secondhand smoke. Okay, so that's that's the sort of thing. So the moment the perception of smoking moved from it was something that someone did to you're actually imposing on me, you're actually imposing a hazard on me, the whole game changed. And I mean, I sort of lived through this. First, there would be, smoking and non-smoking sections in restaurants, and then, of course, they would say, get out altogether, right? And that's the story there. So, of course, there was a lot of policy-making moves, and then there were lawsuits brought by against tobacco companies and public interest litigation, huge settlements, and the power of big tobacco disappeared. That's a US example. But even in India, we used to think that, regulations, even if we come up with them, will not actually work, right? And when Anupamani Ramdas pushed for banning cigarette smoking in public places, I personally thought, oh, this won't work. Why would it ever work here? Who's going to enforce it, right? But actually, if you look at what's happened since then, it's just been observed. Mostly, people do step out and go somewhere else or something like that. And more than anything else, you don't have the prevalence of in-your-face smoking as you used to have before. Okay, there's one other dimension of risk and how it's managed that we need to pay attention to. And this is called the social amplification of risk. Some incident occurs, a tragedy or something like that, and that gets media coverage, that gets people all agitated, and then it ends up having impacts ultimately on policy change, right? It may also stigmatize a particular location or a place or a technology, things like that. There's too much detail here, but basically, media plays a very important role in amplifying or attenuating a risk-related story. Basically, telling the story in such a manner that people get really mad and that sustained attention is paid, or not giving it enough coverage and then it just disappears, right? And so basically that's the domain. But I'll give you a case study here and there where these things happen, right? So the Bhopal gas tragedy, of course, was an example of a risk-related tragedy that had worldwide implications, right? Okay, and people paid attention. It was one of India's most horrific industrial accidents, and the people who died were all innocent people sleeping on the side, of the Union Carbide factory. But interestingly enough, the social amplification, some of it happened here. In terms of the impact on the policy world, it took place as far away as the United States, right? Just before this accident, there were one or two others, similar accidents that took place in the US, but since there are no slums around factories, etc., the same chemical just dissipated and nothing happened. But when these incidents occurred, people started to say, what the hell is going on? What are factories putting in our air, in our water, etc., right? And so there was a movement to pass legislation called the Citizens' Right to Know Act, okay? And this is triggered in the US by the Bhopal tragedy, okay? And so that was put in there. And so the policy measure was that every company has to report to the Environmental Protection Agency what they're emitting into the air and water on an annual basis. Now, who can go out there and figure out what that all means, right? There's a lot of data out there. But, with chemical names and things like that, someone's got to go and figure things out. And that's where non-governmental organizations played a role. One called Environmental Defense actually took that data and put a nice web interface on it. Okay, so if you went to scorecard.org and basically typed in your zip code, it would tell you, okay, based on the publicly available data, these are the top 10 polluters, these are the kinds of risks that you face compared to the worst and best neighborhoods in the country or in your state, etc. And so they made it easier for people to understand, right? Now, the impact of something like this was much more, because no company wants to be on that list as, oh, we are the most dangerous guys in town. They would all really start going about trying to change their practices, saying, can we substitute the material that we're using? Can we change our processes? And so just information provision had so much more impact than a lot of command and control intrusive regulation. Okay? So this is the kind of potential that information sharing can have. And this relates to some of the ideas that you had in the blueprint and how it can be used. In the most recent tragic case of social amplification in India, we had the Nirbhaya tragedy. And you saw how there was a spontaneous uprising, people saying this is, we can't stand this, and these are the kinds of protests that took place in, and of course, what's the social amplification? Immediately, the government got into the act and said, we're going to do something about safety and changing the law, and then they set up the Justice Verma Committee, and that went ahead, conducted great, a series of consultations, and very quickly came up with suggestions for change. And fairly soon, the Lok Sabha passed the amendments to the Juvenile Justice Act, etc., and changed the whole policy framework. In the Rajya Sabha, we took a much longer time. We were basically arguing that the change that was brought in to lower the age of treating a perpetrator as an adult from 18 to 16, that was not appropriate. People are still children at 16 and adults only at 18, was the overall consensus of the HRD committee, of which I was a part, am still a part, and of course, the majority of people in the Rajya Sabha as well. And then the day, on one of the anniversaries of the Nirbhaya tragedy, her mother showed up, came to the Rajya Sabha gallery, and the government decided this is the best day to try and push this legislation through the Rajya Sabha, and it was actually done in that manner, which is not the whole country is watching us. Let's go out there and pass it right away. And so literally public perception and managing public perception played a very active role in the passage of the law. And really, these are some of the more detailed aspects of what that law is all about. Okay. But when you come to the domain of what we're talking about here, about fire risks, right? Now, I didn't know these numbers. And I'm not saying that I'm familiar with all these numbers on a continuous basis, but in the US, we're much more familiar with the notion that fire can happen because there's a lot more wood used in construction and things of that sort. In India, we use bricks and mortar and things of that sort. So it's rare to think about fire accidents taking place all the time. But apparently, according to the National Crime Records Bureau, 49 people die of fire-related incidents every day. So this is quite, we know about the bigger tragedies, but these are routine in some ways. And so that's something that worried me considerably. And there are cases, of course, in India, many, but the Upahar Cinema tragedy in Delhi. But there, what went wrong? People choked to death after being trapped in the balcony. Basic fire safety rules had been broken. Exit routes had been blocked to add more seats. All right. So these are examples of how there may have been rules, but they're not followed, and certainly they're not being implemented in some ways. This is the remnants of the Kamara Mills tragedy just a couple of months ago, early January. And there again, some embers from a hookah, there was enough flammable stuff around, caught fire, and then the whole neighborhood caught fire. And I've been to this neighborhood because they have TV studios there. I've gone and taken part in debates. And here again, how were these allowed? And if they were not allowed, how did they go through? All those sorts of questions arise. There was a tragedy in a firecracker factory in Delhi, and this is the mayor saying, oh, we gave the license, so just keep quiet, don't say anything about it. I'm just, not to pick on her, but the basic point is that the whole regulation of this domain is quite broken. Okay? Part of it may be the state's capacity to implement the laws that they have. The other, of course, is people who own these buildings, where where multiple people come, who expose people to that risk, and who are not following the rules and regulations, or in the case of the Upahar tragedy, who are actively coming in the way. So these are the real problem. And there was an article in Mint which basically said that, and quoting Uday here, we're grossly underprepared. Cities are growing so rapidly without basic infrastructure like fire stations, and almost every accident has the same set of gross violations. So there is a sense that we can try and get hold of some of the problem, try and figure out where the problem is arising from. We see the shortage of response capability, and basically we need to get everyone involved in trying to figure out how to cope with this. And the worry, of course, is that more inspection, more regulation means more opportunities for corruption, more opportunities for the return of the license permit raj and things of that sort. So what do we do? And how do we go forward? What is the role of the public? What's the role of information? And how much are we subject to wherever we go? Right? These are all situations that we face. One behavioral science company consulting firm in Bombay, it's called Final Mile. They have been working on various aspects. For example, the railways has hired them to try and reduce railway fatalities. Would you believe that every day in Bombay suburban rail system, there are a few people who die? Okay. And nobody bats an eyelid again. Okay. So this is really a problem, And so what they do is they've come up with, different kinds of methods. For example, to get people to slow down, they change the nature of markings so that visually you see some change. Yeah, but for railway safety, they've come up with more. This is an unmanned crossing. And so that you have here multiple images of a train approaching, so that the person is much more conscious of the fact that this may actually be this is something to pay attention to. I mean, today things have gone the other extreme. People wanting to take selfies on tracks with oncoming trains, and this is all different levels of what shall we say? These are more graphic ones for cars, to make sure that they also understand not to take that chance and dash across an unmanned level crossing. Okay. There are, of course, we are used to or exposed to graphic images on cigarette packs now. I don't know whether people pay attention to it, but it's certainly there to remind us. Okay. That's one thing, one way of communicating. So should you, in every building, have some very, very graphic pictures, like in the old lifts, which, they would say, don't put your hand in, show an arm cut off and things like that, and blood dripping. Something gory and visual that you don't want, that would really get people to change their behavior. That's one thing. The other, of course, is this whole notion of, where safety is paramount in the operation theater, in the way we fly planes, etc. How do they do it? It's become part of their routine. This whole notion of you have a checklist and it has to be followed, right? And so, this is Dr. Gawande from Harvard, who writes very well, and he has a book called The Checklist Manifesto, where he actually discusses this as a solution, and how maybe that mindset needs to go across in every building, and every month, every year, whatever it is, you actually do these routines and get people familiar with everything that needs to be, with safety-related awareness, okay? And of course, information provision, right? If we have, like that database, that scorecard.org, some kind of a website where buildings are have they been inspected? Have they conducted the? When was the last time they conducted this route? This checklist implementation. If all this information was out there, then people would know that somebody is observing them, and you don't need 1,000 people observing them. Somebody can keep track. You could even automate them and say, if it hasn't been done in a year, an alarm shows up. Lots of things are possible. If we come up with those kinds of solutions, maybe this would allow crowdsourcing of regulation and of management of these kinds of dangers, right? And of course, your own, throughout, in the field of risk regulation, it has been non-governmental organizations that have fought heroically to try and bring about change, and the blueprint is certainly an example of that, which has, it's focused on a collaborative approach, which is good. Otherwise, most often we have confrontation, and when confrontation is there, the police ADGP will not show up; they go to hell, that sort of thing. And collaboration can help us resolve problems in a much more collaborative way. And of course, milestones, goalposts, using technology, and learning more as we go along, right? So for example, recently in UK, in a housing complex, there was a tower that burned, and a lot of people died. And apparently that was caused by some cheap aluminum cladding that was on the outside of the building. Now, if you see in Bangalore, I don't know, it sounds, I'm not technically capable to, or whatever, qualified to say whether it sounded to me that it was similar to what was out there on a lot of buildings out here, right? So then, it's a newer risk that we need to pay more attention to, okay? And in that case, remember I talked about distribution. Apparently cheaper material was used because this was public housing for poorer people, okay? And, so lots of shortcuts were taken, all right? Anyway, so that's really the broad exploration of the domain of how the field of risk analysis has been emerging, how risk regulation takes place, how you see changes in how risks are regulated based on changing public opinion, etc. And I'll pretty much stop here, and the field is open, and whatever, the floor is open for questions. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Professor Gowda. A lot of good case studies there and insights and ideas. We absolutely love the reference of scorecard.org. I think that was a great reference for us. When you started the lecture, you presented the US versus UK perspective, you presented the India perspective, you presented the insurance perspective as well. When it comes to fire, what do you think causes risk the most in India, and where do you think the roots of the fault trees lie?
Okay, one would be awareness, right? So I had a tenant in my own home in JP Nagar, and they had, it was running as an office, it was commercially converted and all that, but basically they had backup batteries, they had a curtain which was too close to that, some spark somewhere, and suddenly I get a call saying your house is on fire. And I'm like, what the hell, right? Now, this awareness of what is allowed and what is not, things of that sort, we have not really, so the first one is awareness. We're not at all, we don't even think of fire-related accidents as something that we have to be concerned about. The second is failures in the larger system, right? When we hear about the short circuits, something caught fire, okay, that's not us causing it. That's something else in the system. Maybe the professionals who put the equipment in, maybe what kind of quality of electricity is coming in through the grid, who knows, right? So that's not our problem, but that's something that needs to be fixed, and you need to ensure that everyone who is, who's installing those systems is doing it in the right manner. And actually, if you look at, various, construction sites, things like that, I mean, there doesn't seem to be much awareness. The people who are doing these kinds of jobs are fairly low skilled. And so there is a lot of work that needs to be done in trying to instill that training and consciousness amongst the professionals in that field as well. So that's the second theme. And so yeah, let's probably stop there for now. Yeah.
Okay. You talked about what affects risk perception. The influence of community being the biggest influence, right? What are some of the best examples you have seen of how communities can be influenced so we can see far greater safety measures in India around fire?
In terms of fire, I may not have an answer, but I mean, I'm just trying to think about where communities rallied around and made a huge difference, right? So we had this one, what shall we say, the Chennai floods, for example, right? So you have a case where, I mean, those floods are not caused just by nature doing its thing. There were certain man-made aspects too with regard to what kind of encroachment had taken place in natural waterways, what kind of, when was water released and how much, and then suddenly that city was inundated. But the community rallied. They rallied around the authorities, and you had a whole group of volunteers on Twitter who actually helped people, get relief, help people get out, inform the authorities of where people were stranded, etc. So that was an example of communities coming together in a very significant way. But for fire, I would say Beyond Carlton is an extraordinary example of an initiative which is really making a difference. Okay, otherwise, imagine that there would have been no organization paying any attention to this at all, right? That would have been the case if we hadn't had that initiative emerge.
Sure. You shared about voluntary versus involuntary and social amplification of risk perception. How could we create a campaign around fire safety that influences the kind of impact we've had, let's say, on smoking, the case example that you mentioned, or even with what happened in Chennai?
Okay. Look at smoking. I mean, many youngsters today are aware of the dangers of smoking and may not even take that first puff, which is where it all starts. But so what I'm trying to say is think about getting them young, right? If we go into schools and bring in an awareness of of fire safety and things like that, and do that in a creative way. Make it a competition for youngsters to do, today they can do their own research, they can come up with their own posters, whatever it is, and suggestions for bringing about change. If you can make this a part of school curricula across schools, not just the elite ones, but every school, then that awareness sort of would come in, and you would have whole generations emerge that would be aware of what's going on, and therefore who would take protective measures, be more aware, and ensure that things don't go bad.
Sure, possibly we could also, through the younger generation, influence the rest of society.
Absolutely.
We've sent an open letter on fire safety to all our political leaders.
Mm-hmm.
What response do you think we can expect? And can we have your support on this?
Oh, yeah. No, my personal support, absolutely. There's no problem with that. In principle, I would think that my party would have no problem with it either. But we have a process in our party. Right now, the Karnataka election manifesto, I had researched for the Congress party nationally, so I can always give my inputs. Mr. Veerap Moily is in charge of our manifesto process, and it's either I can just give him this, or I can arrange a meeting where you can give him a formal representation. I don't see a real problem at all, actually, and this is a welcome measure. And if you look at Mr. Siddaramaiah over the last 4 or 5 years, out of that 165 promises they made, they've certainly adhered to maybe 155. They've actually implemented them. So, you can, this is not a political pitch, but it is. Anyway, so what I'm saying is if we put it in, we should be able to deliver as well. Okay.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we might have time for just one or two questions from the audience. Yes, thank you.
So just a comment and then a query to you, Mr. Gowda. This particular blueprint itself was developed as a response to what the citizens need to be doing. So in that sense, active citizenship. And it's also about holding a mirror to the rest of the society as to what is it we should be doing. So in that, the theoretical framework that you presented so very well, I really resonate with that. Having said that, the question that we have had from Beyond Carlton, working in this area of fire safety and public safety, number one is, we find that unless a number is prefixed with rupees or dollars, we seldom find action. So, if we say that 150,000 people die on the roads of India every year, that has got no meaning, because it doesn't make much of sense to the two-wheeler makers or the road makers or whoever. How do we ensure that the economics of safety is better presented? If a challenge that we are facing as Beyond Carlton, that's the one point that I wanted to say. The second one is we believe that the regulations being in place as they are, whatever they are today, the implementation of that, especially punitive measures in select cases at least, they're just not happening. So I'm not saying that if there are 100 thieves, all 100 need to be caught. But if we can catch 3 and punish them in an exemplar way, that would send a message. This is not happening. We are really seeking ideas here as to what is it that we could be doing.
Okay, on the second part, that's more the judicial process and, and what it goes about doing and when it actually delivers justice. In that Upahar tragedy, the Ansals, I think, they were the builders of the cinema, but they were also the operators. And so they were able to pin liability on them. They did go to jail during the trial for some time, and ultimately they were made to pay, because they were somewhat old, made to pay some big fine, some 30 crores or something like that, and then essentially let go. So there was some visible movement on that front. Now in Kamala Mills, a whole bunch of these restaurant owners have been arrested. That much I can say. But but basically these are sending a signal to the world around us that, hey, if you break these rules, you are going to be culpable and something will happen to you. But the larger culture is that there is no rule that cannot be broken or,
Obfuscation of the responsibility.
Yeah. No. There's an attitude of, we can just bribe our way through, right? I mean, so that's, rather than thinking about, we should not do this here, right? Look, why shouldn't we do it here? Or if these rooftop restaurants, I actually like rooftop restaurants, especially in a city like Bangalore. But what about the fire safety aspects? Are those thought through? And have they been implemented? Most people would take the shortcut of not going through that, right? That's dangerous. I mean, actually, there are all kinds of risks that lurk on the road. In my part of South Bangalore, there are, if you want some nice hot chips, right? Often there is a big vessel on the side of the street, and this is a very dangerous thing. I've only come across one tragedy where in Delhi, in a similar situation, I think some child was, I think a woman who was carrying a child was hit by a vehicle. The child flew from her hands into a bag of oil. I mean, this is not something we want to discuss, but basically, those risks should not be there. Why should hot oil be on the side of the street? What if something goes wrong? These are all things that we just routinely accept. But those are the dangers. Anyway, so I do think that exemplary punishment would actually, make a huge difference. But the larger attitude is it won't happen to me, and people to get away with it. Getting to the first part, right, about the citizens' initiative, right? This has less to do with what you were talking about. It has to do with something called the logic of collective action, right? Most of, if you improve fire safety for everybody, whether I help to bring that about or not, I still benefit from it, right? So I have very little incentive to go out and spare my time and effort to go about, bringing about that outcome. And I'd say, chalo, let them do it. More power to them. Tum aage badho, tumhare saath hai, whatever they say. That sort of thing. And basically, so the potential for collective action is way more than actual collective action. So that's where I was saying integrated with schools and things of that sort. Another initiative there for children would be, as a homework assignment, go home and check in your apartment complex whether, all these things are in place. Come and report to us. I mean, these sorts of things. There are different ways of involving kids and, promoting that change in a way that is not confrontational, but actually gets more people involved and conscious about what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you. Was anyone on this side? Yeah, sure. Okay, yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you very much, sir, for, sharing the knowledge with us. And I was fortunate I didn't have to go to IIM to be a part of listening to Dr. Gowda. You have been really encouraging us and in a way, in the sense that you said school is the right place to start. And this is not just about fire safety message, it can be about road safety, it can be about public safety and first aid. And we have been desperately trying to kind of propagate the message on road safety, but the problem is getting into schools, because and the time which is given for these kind of activities is very little, considering the broad curriculum that they have to finish within a certain frame of time. While there are many NGOs like ours who would really like to go out and start there, because that is one place where you can see a sea of change coming about. Would the government do something to help us? Perhaps, I'm not saying make it a gradable kind of a thing where the children have to learn by rote. But as you said, and as you're so right, some way which we can make these activities interesting and interactive, and they go home with a message.
Yeah, see, in certain schools, there's already certain boards, there's something called socially useful and economically productive work or something like that, right? And so there is scope for something like this, right? And what we need to do is come up with these creative exercises, something that makes it fun. And I think schools would also then embrace the idea. But what we need to do is build that bridge. I mean, I can connect you with a variety of school managements. I don't want to be, thrust it down anyone's throat as a governmental regulation. But if we experiment and try it, you might actually lead to something that would be adopted by one set of schools, and then later in different boards we may need to actually mandate it.
I would be grateful.
As part of citizenship overall.
Yeah, I would be grateful if we can get some sort of an inroad.
And your
into
NGO
this.
is what?
The Arundhati Foundation.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you so much, Professor Gowda. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you for those wonderful insights, the case examples, and offering your support to Beyond Carlton.